what is it that makes a prenuptial agreement enforceable in the state of Illinois?
So the first important thing is going to be
Welcome to the Illinois Family Law Insider Podcast. I'm Katie VanDeusen, a managing partner at Sterling Lawyers. And with me today is Reyna Herrera. She's an associate attorney that we have at the firm. Thanks for joining me today, Reyna.
Hi, happy to be here.
So, Reyna, today we're going to be talking about legitimate strategies in divorce, specifically as it relates to prenuptial agreements and maybe planning ahead. So, today we're going to be talking about smart and legitimate strategies when it comes to protecting finances, whether it be throughout the course of a marriage or prior to marriage, and then the impact that that could have on a divorce proceeding. So, we're going to be specifically honing in on prenuptial agreements and how that kind of proactive planning can really change the game when a relationship maybe shifts over time. So specifically, Reyna, what is a prenup and why should someone think that a prenup is a smart strategy to implement prior to marriage?
Yeah, so a prenuptial agreement is essentially both parties coming together and saying, in the unfortunate event that this marriage ends by divorce or legal separation, how are we going to divide the marital estate? How are we, splitting the house, the cars, things like that? And I feel like a common misconception is people are like, well, we don't have a lot of money, so why do we need a prenup? But I would say, it's just like car insurance. You hope you don't get into an accident, but you still pay your car insurance every month. A prenup is the same thing. No one wants to get divorced, but in the event you do, you have this, pre-planned insurance policy to help get you through it.
Exactly. It gives both sides real clarity as to what they're agreeing to and what to expect should they ever get to that point in their relationship. I definitely think I totally agree in terms of your feedback on this is not just for the wealthy. This is for anyone who's considering entering into a marriage and having that clarity on both sides as to what will happen if they ever find themselves getting divorced. Shifting gears, Reyna, and talking more about prenuptial agreements, what is it that makes a prenuptial agreement enforceable in the state of Illinois?
So the first important thing is going to be full financial disclosure. So, both parties just being as upfront as possible regarding their assets, their debts, they owe liabilities or anything like that from their own individual property. And then, so the other spouse is basically just completely aware kind of what they're getting into, by entering into this marriage. And it's not required, but we recommend that both people have attorneys just again to make sure, all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and everyone completely understands what's actually going into that prenup. And that it's voluntarily, not one side is forcing the other to enter this prenup.
And then in terms of topics that a prenuptial agreement cannot touch or cannot cover, do you have any insight as to what those topics are and what shouldn't be included in a prenuptial agreement?
Yes, you cannot put anything in a prenup related to child-related issues. So child support, parenting time, decision-making, those are all future discussions that are going to have to be had. You can't preemptively decide, who's going to get the kids and how much you're going to pay in child support a month.
Got it. And then in terms of terms, is there any concern as it relates to maybe the terms of the prenuptial agreement being unfair or one-sided? Are there any concerns with that from your standpoint or your experience?
Yes. So I would say, the judges in general in family law, their main concern is it equitable? Is it fair to both sides? So, if one party is a millionaire and they're earning all the substantial income during the marriage and one party earns nothing, you can't just say that the other party gets absolutely nothing from, the wealthier off person. It can't be so one-sided that it's just completely unfair to one party. The judge is probably not going to enter that.
Yeah, or look very skeptically on that. It kind of just opens up a can of worms as to whether or not that prenup is enforceable, right?
Yeah.
And then have you ever had a situation where a good prenuptial agreement helped avoid kind of a long court battle, or maybe even where the lack of a prenuptial agreement created kind of unnecessary chaos or instability throughout a case?
Yeah, I think I can just speak to the latter that, most people don't have a prenup. And because of that, that's why divorces go on for so long. They've never talked about these issues beforehand. They don't have a plan. And if you cannot come to an agreement, the judge is deciding for you, which again leads people to kind of feel like they're not being heard or feel slighted because they have no control over the process anymore, versus the prenup puts you in control. You're deciding the terms, you're deciding the agreement, and that can just streamline the entire process versus spending months arguing about topics that you've never really talked about before.
Definitely. That makes total sense. And then in terms of a follow-up question, can someone protect future income or maybe career growth that might come into play after they're married?
Yes. So an example would be, if someone started a business before the marriage, typically any income earned during the marriage is marital. But if your income is coming straight from a non marital business, you can argue that the income you got from that business is also non marital throughout the marriage. But that's going to be more clean cut and easier to enforce if that's listed in a prenup versus trying to explain to a judge after the fact that no, this money was always mine, prior to the marriage.
Totally agree. And again, using a prenuptial agreement as a tool to kind of curb those arguments or that kind of protracted litigation at a later date, and having that clarity and knowing that upfront and having those terms set out clearly in a prenuptial agreement would be huge, very beneficial. And then have you ever had a case where a prenuptial agreement assisted with clarity on exactly what was marital versus non-marital, and how did that play out in, let's say a litigation based case?
Yeah, so I think again, when the parties are just very clear on, this was my inheritance before, this was my car before, again, it just streamlines that whole process. And it also just makes it easier for the judge to understand. Again, they're trying to decide what's equitable, what's fair to both sides. And as long as both parties have been honest and it's equal, a judge is way more likely to enter that. And I feel like that's what I've seen in where the parties actually had these conversations beforehand.
And then, Reyna, in your experience, have you ever or do you ever get like red flags when it comes to whether or not a prenuptial agreement would be enforceable? Or are there any tips maybe you have from an attorney standpoint to increase the likelihood that a prenuptial agreement will be enforceable?
Yeah. So I do think the first one and the most important one is just being as honest as possible. When one side's not really willing to give up documents or proof about their income, or they're trying to say a business is worth less than it is, that's kind of a red flag. Judges also pick up on that and don't really take kindly to that. So if you're not being as upfront as possible, the judge is probably going to say that it's not equitable and not enforce the prenup. Or if it comes out even after the prenup is entered that you've hid this whole business or you've hid this whole asset, the whole prenup could just be invalidated. And then all the work that you've done and the conversations you've had mean nothing.
Right. And talk to specifically like timing wise. So, whenever we're considering a prenuptial agreement and like timing surrounding that, do you have any insight or advice as it relates to, the timing of execution of a prenup in comparison to the date of marriage?
Yes. So I would say as attorneys, we try not to do prenups less than 30 days out. And even that's kind of pushing it.
Yep.
Again, because of that like voluntary part of it, you don't want someone to feel rushed into signing a prenup or say that they didn't have time, to review everything carefully. So I would say give it at least like a good 60, 90 days if you're considering, starting a prenup process, especially because the disclosure also takes time. Attorneys need time to review all those financial documents.
So true. So it's better. What I'm hearing is it's better if you're going to do a prenup, do it sooner rather than later. Proactively, plan that accordingly and make sure you give yourself as well as your soon to be spouse enough time for full disclosure and, set yourself up for a window prior to the actual marriage so that someone isn't arguing that they were, under duress or signed this, under the gun. It's like you just want to give yourself more time. And then what would you say are some strategic but still really fair things that someone can consider doing before or during a divorce case to really plan ahead?
So again, I would say, just have these conversations early with your partner. Try to get them to see where you're coming from. Like you're not anticipating a divorce, but you're just trying to kind of protect your assets. So in that case, also, if there is something that you want to be solely yours, You should never mix it with marital property. You should never put it, in each other's names. If you have a sole inheritance or you have a sole business, you just really want that defined early on as this is going to be solely mine. And again, if that's in writing, if it's in a prenup, it's just going to make it easier down the line to enforce that argument.
And then in terms of closing on this particular topic of prenuptial agreements, what is your advice or maybe your number one tip for someone who's thinking about a prenuptial agreement, but really afraid or maybe just scared that they may offend their soon to be spouse? They're afraid to broach that topic and how to talk about it with them. What's your number one tip for that?
Yeah, and I can honestly say from like a personal experience, my fiance was very much like, I don't want a prenup, until I kind of sat him down and just explained again, like the analogy to car insurance. It's really just an insurance policy. I am not saying like I'm only after your money or I don't want, to be married to you forever. I think when you look at it from like an objective standpoint and kind of take the emotion out of it and literally just say, hey, this is just to protect both of us, I think that kind of softens the blow and just makes the other person understand like you're not doing it out of malicious intent. You just want to protect both of you in this instance.
Absolutely. I think that's such amazing advice, Reyna, in terms of helping people approach and talk about that topic openly together. So thank you so much, Reyna, for joining me today to talk through details as it relates to prenuptial agreements and kind of strategic planning ahead when it comes to these types of situations. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So you've decided that having a prenup is a smart move. And you've had the tough conversations, you're trying to be fair, and you've taken steps to protect your future. But what if all of that effort still falls apart because of a single, often overlooked mistake? In our next episode, we are revealing the most common misstep that ends up costing couples big time, both emotionally and financially. So watch now to protect yourself before it's too late.